Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever in the world you're joining us from today. My name is Julie Ray, and I'm the managing editor for World News at Gallup. So today, my colleagues Mohammed Yunus, Riley Brands, and I will be sharing what we've learned about finding stories in the data from one of the largest repositories of the issues facing mankind, the World Poll, as well as from other data sources. So we're also going to be sharing what we've learned about connecting the data with the right audiences and working with media to tell the right stories. So just to go over a few of the logistics. So a virtual workshop wasn't exactly what we'd planned when we came up with the idea for the session. But we're going to try our best to keep everybody engaged and ensure that you walk away with something that you can use with your organization. So just going over the plan for what we have today, we have 3 basic segments. So each of us, Mohammed, Riley, and myself, will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then that'll be followed by an interactive portion with some multiple choice questions to make sure that everybody is still awake and listening. And then we'll provide a few takeaways.
Hello, Julie?
Hello?
Julie?
Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Julie, hi, I apologize for interrupting you. We cannot listen to you. There is a shortage with internet. Something is happening because we cannot listen to you. Sometimes we listen, sometimes we don't. Please, if you could, if they can verify the sound.
Julie, I haven't missed any part of your presentation, so it may be on their end.
Okay.
We should also mention,
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. We should also mention too that this is all being recorded. So if you are having audio issues, you can definitely access this later. If your internet connection is not strong enough to receive the feed, it is a lot of data coming through.
Patricia, did you hear that? Okay, so I think we'll just kind of move ahead, and like Mo said, this is going to be recorded. So if you're not watching us live, you know, you can download this and watch this at a later time. But one thing that's important to that, you can still add questions and make notes to the chat, and we'll be able to see that. So just kind of going back a little bit. So each of us is going to have a little presentation. And then we'll follow that with an interactive portion with a few key questions, just true or false, pretty easy. And then we're going to provide a few key takeaways that you can in turn apply in your own situation. And then if we have time, and I think we will, at the end, we'll open it up to questions about the different challenges that you might be having with your data communications. And then we're going to try to learn from each other in the remaining minutes that we do have. And again, this is going to be recorded. So if you're not watching us live, please still feel free to add questions in the chat. So, but first, we're going to try to start with you. So if you're feeling comfortable doing this in the chat, please tell us what your role is within your organization. You don't have to do this, but it's good information for us to have. And it also will get you familiar with using the chat to ask questions. And feel free to ask us questions throughout the workshop. We'll get to them at the end. Don't fear. So anyway, so that's about it for the ground rules or our instructions. So we'll get started. And I'll turn it over to Mohammed Yunus, the editor-in-chief at Gallup. Mohammed, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Julie. And I'm just getting excited typing back to you all here in the chat. Thank you so much for those of you who are already typing to us. Again, I know some of us may be having internet issues, but it sounds like most of us can definitely hear and are together. My name is Mohammed Yunus. I'm editor-in-chief at Gallup. What that basically means is I get to lead the team that produces all of the content you see on news.gallup.com, whether it's the polling that we do here in the United States, in Washington, where I'm based, and across the US, or all over the world. And I'll be talking a little bit more about our global polling today than our US polling, although we can discuss the relevance of data in all kinds of contexts, and certainly presidential election is not off topic. Let me tell you a little bit more about Gallup first. Gallup was an organization that was founded in the 1930s by Dr. George Gallup. His mission was to really prove that you can create representative samples of larger populations and track what the public is thinking about the issues that matter to them the most. His commitment was to build an institution that was nonpartisan, employee-owned, and committed to data rigor in order to help leaders have more effective information to tackle the challenges that they tackle. Since then, Gallup is now an organization that is worldwide, global. Many of our colleagues out of London actually had a separate session in this forum on some of the SDGs that we track across the world. But our commitment to nonpartisan and data rigor approach to understanding what's happening in the world has never really changed. Presidential elections are a big part of what people think of when you mention Gallup. It's interesting for you all as data scientists and analysts to know that Dr. Gallup actually used presidential elections as a testing ground for proving his sampling method. He intentionally chose presidential elections because it had a dichotomous outcome, and it was something that was reported very publicly and had a lot of public attention. So while most people think of Gallup and think of US presidential elections, our passion is really data and how to tell a story with data in a way that can inform not only the public, but leaders to be more effective in what they do. So our true passion really is to study how a life is lived. And one of Dr. Gallup's very famous quotes is, at the time he was alive, there are 4 billion ways to live a life. We should study each and every one. The Gallup World Poll was an effort we started in 2005. I should mention that the Gallup organization actually conducted international polling in the 60s and 70s. In the 1970s, we conducted the first study that actually captured about 3/4 of the world's population in what was then called the World Survey. Since 2005, we have made a 100-year commitment and invested literally tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars into building primary sampling units across 140 countries across the world. Obviously, this audience is very familiar with why that's needed. The importance of having that K constant, if you will, metrics across regions, across languages, across cultures is so critical when you think about things like human development, sustainable development goals, just reporting on how people are living their lives. While we have political risk analysts and classic economic metrics and GDP per capita metrics that can tell a lot about what's happening in a country, what we've learned is that asking people themselves on how their own lives are going on the local level is actually the most accurate way to understand what's happening in the world and what's happening in countries that are very different linguistically, culturally, religiously, and more importantly than all of those, in my opinion, economically, than the one you live in and still have a kind of a lens into what's happening. As of now, we've conducted over 2 million interviews across the world. Julie Ray has been an absolute hero in that effort. Julie has been with Gallup since before I was, and was really there at the very beginning of the World Poll. It's funny to think of how it started, really. Donald Rumsfeld is, for those of you who are familiar with Middle East politics, probably know him very well. He's the former Secretary of Defense or Minister of Defense for the United States during the War on Terror. And he was in a press conference and somebody asked him during the Afghanistan invasion, what do the citizens of Afghanistan think about the US's invasion? And in a very typical Rumsfeldian kind of style, he basically said, it's not like you can do a poll and ask them what they think. Our chairman and CEO, Jim Clifton, basically was watching that and asked himself, why can't you do a poll? And really in 2004, 2005, he gathered the main, our lead researchers and methodologists around the company, led by the late Dr. Gail Muller, who was really a hero to many of us at Gallup, and is really the founding father of the world poll. And asked these methodologists, why can't we do this? And can it be done? And of course, as researchers, we know, of course, it can be done. And that's exactly what we've been doing for the past 15 years. We've made a 100-year commitment to tracking key metrics, really that follow sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs across the world and reporting on them just on our own as Gallup. We also partner with organizations like United Nations agencies and others across the world, foundations, that want to track really key issues like Lloyd's World Risk Poll, understanding how people face risk in different parts of the world, different regions of the world, different socioeconomic realities across the world, understanding financial inclusion with the World Bank, understanding malnutrition and hunger with FAO, working on tracking where modern day slavery is still occurring with organizations like Walk Free and many, many others. So the World Poll has been not only useful for us as researchers to just have an amazing, nationally representative global look at what's happening in the world from the perspective of citizens, it's also helped us partner with some really critical organizations to try to track what is happening with some really critical human development issues across the world. Now, data is great. We all love data. We are all data fanatics to some degree, but data is only as good as its use. And that's another really big passion of ours at Gallup. Engaging decision makers and the public with data is really what we see as our final deliverable. It's not really just conducting a poll, but it's about analyzing the data and then presenting it in a way that can help people make more informed decisions. One of the really important concepts we follow and are really committed to is that if leaders have bad data or if leaders are misinformed, the more they try to lead, the worse they'll actually make things for the people they're leading. This is true in an organization like a company where we use our metrics and sciences to create engaged workplaces, strengths-based workplaces, et cetera. But of course, it's also true in a society where you're dealing with major policy issues, criminal justice issues. They really runs the gamut of the work you all do with the data in your respective fields. So that's the World Poll. We, of course, love to answer any questions you have about it. I want to move on now to the next slide and ask you all a quiz, because this was, of course, supposed to happen in person. But here it is. True or false? Big data are always better. And as you can guess, my answer is false. The reason I say that, big data, of course, and modeling and machine learning is a really important part of what we do at Gallup. We use it when relevant. But in this era of big data and modeling, what we found looking back into events like the uprisings in the Arab world, the vote for Brexit, the war in the Ukraine, see a series of really unpredictable social events that took place across very different countries, very different realities. It was actually how people assessed their own lives that was the most useful metric in seeing where things were going in those countries. So it wasn't GDP per capita. Of course, everyone, I'm originally from Egypt. All of us who follow the Middle East know Tunisia had just received accolades on some of the privatization policies they'd pursued right before protests erupted there. And what we found in all of these countries, whether it's a developing country, the United States before the election of President Trump, how people evaluate their lives on the local level is actually some of the most useful data that's out there. Now, leaders can lead more effectively if they have access to valid data, they can understand the data. But what we mean by understand the data is really to understand what it means for them. One of the challenges we have as data researchers and analysts is we love data. Usually the audience that we're sharing the data with does not. and they want to get to the so what. And what Julie and Riley are going to take you through is how to basically go from having a wonderful data finding to get to that so what for your audience, thinking about who that audience is. Is it a policymaker in your agency? Is it a leader in your foundation? Is it a colleague across your industry that you want to partner with? Is it the public? Is it a student body that you're trying to inform? No matter what it is, having the data and reporting it on its own is only sort of like the first half step, but really getting to the point where people understand what it means for them and their decisions are key. So methods are key, but data is only as good as the analysts using them. In this era of big data, small data may actually be the most valuable. Leaders can only lead more effectively if they understand how the data is relevant to the decisions they need to make. Otherwise, the more they lead, the more they make things worse. And with that, I want to pass it over to Julie to tell us how she does what she does with the data once we get them in from 140 countries.
Thanks, Mo. So again, my name is Julie Ray, and I'm the managing editor for the World News at Gallup. And like Mo had mentioned, I've been blessed over the past 15 years to work on our World Poll project and be able to share the world's stories with the rest of the world and really give people who aren't always heard, give them a voice. But my main job is to find the stories in the data and to tell them. So I'm part analyst, consultant, data journalist, and editor. But one of the things that I like to think about is that I'm also solving puzzles. And really, when you're thinking about and looking for the story in your data, that's really how you need to approach it. It's a puzzle or a mystery, and you need to solve it. So stepping back a little bit, if you think about why people ask questions and why we collect data and why others collect data, it's because they don't know something, or it's because they need to solve a problem. And sometimes it's both. Oftentimes it's both. So you first need to think about where your data fall in that narrative. Sometimes the data are the whole story. It's a bold new solution that no one's ever thought of before. And sometimes the data are just really a really important part of a much larger conversation. So this is one of the reasons that I think it's always best to let the data drive. Let your data show how they solve a problem or how they uncover new ones. This also really helps us to avoid that trap that's really easy to fall into of confirmation bias, where the data confirm what we think we already know. But I know from writing reports, articles, making presentations that and dealing with hundreds of thousands of cases of data, finding that narrative isn't always very easy. So hopefully today I'm going to share some easy tools with you that I use and that you can use, and also some tools on how to best communicate those narratives. Storyboarding, it's really, really simple and effective. It's a way that you can find the main headlines in your data, particularly when you're working with really large or multiple data sets. In my case, when you're writing about 160 countries around the world and dealing with 2 million cases of data. So this is what I mean. And you may think this sounds like a lot of work, but it really isn't. And it helps you organize your thoughts. And I found that it saves me time in the long run. So try this when you're looking at your data set. Comb through your data set and note your interesting findings and patterns and any other observances that you can make. Then go back through your notes and organize them, adding headlines that summarize the key findings, and then go back again through your headlines and write them so they tell a full little mini story when you put them all together. So this is the sentence here that I have on the screen is what it looks like when you have 5 different sample groups who are asked the same question, and I tell this from personal experience. Parents who are convinced that learning algebra is important. Students are less sure. Most educators would agree with parents, but many teachers do not believe algebra is important for all students. And that comes from 5 different data sets, people all being asked the same question for 5 different samples. And it's as, I would say it's as easy as that, but I know it's not. So, you know, before you tell your story, you need to ask yourself some questions. You not only need to know what story you're telling, which you just discovered through using your storyboard activity. You need to know who you're telling your story to and how and where you're telling it. So you need to think about who your audience is, because you need to write in the language of your readers and reach them where they're at. And just remember, academics are not reporters, reporters are not policymakers. And why would you write to them the same way? Because you don't want them to do the same thing with or take the same actions. So one thing I would note is save your regression analysis for academic journals. But regardless of who you're writing to, always write clearly and concisely. This transfers across any audience that you're trying to reach. One of the other things is that you need to know where your story will be told. Is it going to be online, in a blog? Is it an article? Is it, you know, are you going to tweet it in social media? You absolutely need to consider your medium. And with so much of our work done online, I'm going to actually be talking about that a little bit more in more detail. But one thing, and there's a stat here from Nielsen Group, is don't forget, even academics don't read every single word online, so don't expect them to. The last thing on this, in this section that I'm going to talk about, is that you need to really clearly understand the purpose for why you're sharing this story. And this goes back to understanding who your audience is, particularly if your goal is to get media exposure or get policymakers to act. So I told you I'd come back to this. You really need to write for your medium. But the bad news is that if you're writing for web or mobile, you don't have a whole lot of time. And you're also fighting to keep people's attention, and the marketplace for ideas is already very, very crowded. So you've got about 10 seconds. But the good news is that it's not all doom and gloom. The good news is that if you can get them to stay past that 10 seconds, they'll actually stick around longer and see what you have to say. But to get them to stay, you need to make sure that your online content is digestible, scannable, and concise. And now you've heard me say concise twice. It's for a reason. It's really, really important. And actually, we found that paragraph length actually predicts how much your readers are paying attention. So it's up to you to make every single word that you use count and make sure that everything says something meaningful. So, I mean, there's very, very little value in completely duplicating something. Like text should always complement instead of duplicate your information. So don't tell people what you have in your chart or your graph. They can already see that. One other thing that we've had a lot of success with, and it's been a lot of fun to do this too, is think about how you can package your content. We've had pretty good success creating story packages, and it blends interactives, infographics, and regular articles, different ways to tell a story. But feel free to experiment with different ways of, and think of different ways of delivering the data and engaging your readers and your audience that stretch beyond just delivering a report or an article. You can be creative. You have a lot of tools at your disposal. So in fact, one of the things that we found is that sometimes it's the best way to tell a story is without words, or at least with very few of them. Infographics and data interactives can be really effective ways to tell your story. We found in a recent example that we created a data interactive that actually let people play with data from 140 plus countries on people's emotions, whether they felt anger or sadness the previous day. We created a data interactive that let people just kind of explore the data in multiple ways. We had heat maps, we had tables, we had articles. So we really let people just have an experience with our data. So if anybody's aware of how people spend time and what it means to get somebody to stay longer than 10 seconds, that interactive that we developed, the average time spent on it was 14 minutes, which is an eternity on the web. But if you have to use words, which I do, be careful not to numb people with the numbers. And it's really easy when you've got great data to share, 160 countries, 1,000 cases per country, 2 million interviews. But you really need to be aware of doing a data dump. Nobody wants to read it, not journalists, not academics. In fact, you'd be better off delivering a table. So one of the things to do, you can break your figures up. And I have a few tricks on how to do that and a few examples of how I've done that. So you can try leading with a key finding and the implications instead of a figure. Cover the basics in short and simple text. And again, add comparisons in short sentences. And remember, I said short. And what I said about short paragraphs and keeping people's attention, that's, you actually have fewer words, fewer sentences, you get people to pay more attention. And the last thing is you can simply cut the figure out altogether and get right to your point. So just like Mo, I have a quick quiz for you. So true or false? More numbers crammed into a sentence, the better. I'm going to say false. This again gets to numbing people with numbers. Second question, readers will stay on your webpage longer if you can get them to stay for 10 seconds, they run marathons, or you have 10,000 word paragraphs. Obviously, it's if you can get them to stay for 10 seconds. Just to kind of reiterate, sometimes the data are the story, and sometimes they're part of the conversation, and it's up to you to figure out what that is. But remember, you need to always write for your audience. Solve for their problems because those are the ones that matter. And regardless of your audience, write clearly and concisely. And I think I said that 3 times. So it's really, really important. And also sometimes don't forget that sometimes the best way to tell a story is without words. Use infographics, interactives, different ways to tell the data story. Tailor your message to your medium, whether it's online or print. People read differently depending on which medium they're getting the story in. And sometimes the best, and resist, always resist numbing people with numbers. And before I numb you anymore, I'm going to turn it over to Riley.
All right, well, thank you, Julie, and thank you, Mohammed, for setting that up so beautifully. I'm going to be spending the next couple of minutes talking about the perspective that Gallup's communications team brings to the table when we're thinking about a data project. A couple of caveats that I would say are just important to keep in mind as I'm going through here. First, I'm focused in particular here in these next couple of slides on how to work with your research partners to generate media coverage. Some of the same principles apply to communicating data findings on other channels, but as Julie just really beautifully laid out, you do need to consider the unique audiences on each carefully. Some of the examples that I'll show are from our global research, as Julie and Mohammed have been speaking about. Some of them will be from US focused research that we do. Of course, some of the particulars of how you might use the tactics that I talk about will depend a little bit on, how many geographies are represented. It gets a little bit more complicated, of course, once you're trying to, get permission from, survey contacts to be recontacted when you're doing it across multiple geographies. So some of the same underlying principles apply, but I just thought I would throw that out there. And then also, finally, I would say, because of our experience as Gallup, my experience and thoughts assume that you'll be working with survey data as opposed to other forms of data. So I'll go ahead and dive in here now to what you see on this slide. So I wanted to share just a couple of key points of departure when our communications team thinks through a data project. First, we believe that all good news stories start with data. In fact, I was even listening recently to a webinar from The Economist where they were talking about their editorial process. And this was a point that one of their journalists made. No matter whether it's, an in-depth, detailed data dive written by a data journalist, or it's more of a thematic story that's written by kind of a functional beat writer, there's always some initial investigation of data, setting aside things like truly breaking news events. There's some initial investigation of data that serves as a kernel to sort of decide, how much of a story is there or how much of a story isn't there. So that's definitely helpful for us to keep in mind, because that gives us something to work with and it gives us something to give that's valuable to journalists. Another idea is that, we definitely respect this idea that survey research is a form of journalism at scale. In a way, our infrastructure offers a way to ask journalistic questions much faster and of many more people than journalists can ask of individual sources. And of course, that's great news because, again, it means we have something to add to the conversation that journalists can use. But, in order for this sort of scaled up journalism that I've talked about to be effective, we need to ask questions in novel ways and also in ways that honor the expertise and ultimate decision-making authority of our research teams. So those are just some of the starting points. And Julie, if you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide. So the way I would say that we've found to create the greatest impact as a communications team is through an advisory capacity overall. Whether you're a researcher or a communicator on this call, I'm sure you've seen it happen at least once before where, a very, well-written and very, captivating report based on new research gets dropped on the laps of the communications team maybe a week before launch or even less. And I'm sure you've heard the directive before that, we need to make sure that this goes far and wide. We need to make sure it makes a splash. We need to make sure that it pops, sizzle, whatever the verb is or whatever adjective you've heard applied. Well, indeed, if that is an important part of the overall objectives of the project, there are certainly some ways that you can work steps into the process to better sort of reverse engineer that outcome. So here, what I think about is sort of from a tactical standpoint, it helps a ton for the communications team to be looped in early, potentially even as early as when, the survey questionnaire is being drafted. Now, I realize that that can be easier said than done. And sometimes there might be sort of a built-in expectation or culture where, the communications team will take the findings once they have them. But it does require the conversation to be had with your decision-making stakeholders about aligning their communications objectives with process and then explaining the necessary necessary resources to make those outcomes possible. And of course, this is something that of course becomes easier to do over time as you establish a track record for delivering results, but it's certainly helpful to start having the conversation now with your research partners and other partners, just to get the ideas rolling. So if you, Julie, next slide, please. So assuming that you've got the necessary time and can slot yourself in early enough, I wanted to talk a little more about the basic value that your communications team can bring to the table. I think that what's really helpful is once you have basic alignment on what you're trying to do with a survey research project and basically who you're trying to reach, what sorts of topics you're trying to cover, is to think about essentially how you can shift the frame a little bit. So think about how you can sort of adjust the lens through which the issue is viewed or analyzed. And I think it's helpful to think of it as just that, sort of a shift or adjustment of kind of the camera lens, to use that metaphor, rather than entirely recomposing the shot. And so this example here is kind of one that I think is instructive. And note again that it's a journalistic one. Some of the same storytelling roots are in stories like this as can be found in survey research. So this was a story that actually made the rounds in the New York Times in the US a few months back. For me, I think it was attention grabbing for a few reasons. It took an issue, or rather you could say a set of issues, housing, housing access, discrimination, and the intersection between them, that was certainly already of interest. And then it shifted the frame a little bit. Again, admittedly, this is an American narrative, but I think over here, a lot of the narrative about disparities in housing access tends to focus on challenges in getting into housing in the first place. As a country, our history abounds with practices meant to keep certain groups out of housing in certain areas. And it also has plenty of stories of the increasing difficulty that rising real estate prices combined with stagnant wages have imposed on communities trying to get into housing and purchase housing. And, that has disproportionate effects on certain groups. But here, this story shows how discrimination extends even further than realized and even affects a part of the process that I think a lot of people assumed was objective, or at least more objective. Julie, next slide, if you don't mind. So if you're a communications advisor, how can you try to reverse engineer something like that, with a shifted frame on a topic that's of interest and that also sort of has a so what to it, as Mohammed talked about earlier? That would absolutely be catnip to reporters if you can, figure out the way to build that. So what I think is helpful is to sit down with the researchers working on the project and break the thematic focus down into sort of what I call micro experiences. So consider what you're focusing on, who and why. Put yourself in the shoes of a respondent and imagine the individual experiences or decision tree that they'd face relative to your topic of interest. So here what you see on this slide is actually an example that came from some work that Gallup did about a year or so ago. We were working on a survey about the impact of high healthcare costs in the US. Of course, it's something that is a big issue, top of mind for a lot of people based on how the US healthcare system is set up. So we wanted to take a topic, which yes, has been surveyed a lot, and try to come up with something new out of what we were building. So essentially what we did was we put ourselves in the shoes of, the healthcare consumer, the patient. We started by imagining ourselves as them. The patient experience is first to go to the doctor. From there in the US, because of how our healthcare system is set up, the patient receives some sort of bill depending on their insurance. From there, they have to sit down and think about how they're going to pay. Should they dip into checking or savings? Should they use a credit card? Might they have to borrow money? Then once you start to think about those different ways of paying for it, you can start to think about the different next steps from each of those. We zeroed in on, okay, well, if people are having to borrow money to pay for their care, then how much? And so we ended up asking those two questions as part of this survey. Have you had to borrow money to pay for care in the last 12 months? If so, how much? And from that, once we got the survey results back, we were able to come up with a percentage of Americans who had to do that, we were able to sort of create an estimate of what the total number of US adults was who had to borrow money, and then also to come up with sort of an aggregate estimate of how much money had been borrowed in the United States in the last 12 months to pay for care. And that was, I think, it was definitely a different way of presenting the impact of high healthcare costs. And it was one that journalists, where I think journalists' attention was definitely caught because they hadn't seen it presented in exactly that way. And I think, by extension too, policymakers saw that, and it really kind of drove home for them the extent of just how much, how much pain high healthcare costs were causing for Americans. So all that together, I think is sort of a helpful way of just sort of charting out in a more analytical way how you might get to items that that could deliver newsworthy results and deliver communications outcomes that might be really helpful for getting the word out about your research. Julie, next slide, if you don't mind. Another great way to garner attention for your survey research findings, of course, is to add a human element. Going back to what I said earlier about, the economist writers thinking of how, data is sort of the starting point of their stories. If you think about a lot of stories, they do take that kernel of data and then they sort of weave additional human stories around that. So if you can find a way to incorporate human stories into sort of the macro level data that you're presenting, that can be pretty compelling for reporters. This gets down, admittedly, into sort of the very nitty gritty of when you're getting into pitching reporters about the new findings that you have. And of course, some of these things have to be sort of considered carefully depending on, exactly, as I said before, where you're operating, what sorts of permissions will be needed to do all of these things. So keep that in mind. But what I think can be helpful when it comes to adding this human element is things like, can you conduct in-depth interviews? Can you recontact survey respondents, getting their permission to publish their more fleshed out opinions, or potentially, to be made available to reporters who might want to talk further with them about their sort of more kind of drawn out and qualitative responses. Are there partners in the field who can help you find individuals who exemplify your research questions? In the case of work that we did last year on the challenges faced by post-startup small business owners, we worked with our partner organization to identify entrepreneurs who had used the best practices suggested by the research to great success. And this combination of macro level findings with individual experiences was certainly helpful in getting some top tier media coverage, as you see on the right-hand side of the slide there. Next slide, Julie. Think about the timing too. This may seem like a basic element, but it really is critically important. This is something that we saw just within the last, I think, month or so. When it comes time to release your findings, keep on top of media coverage themes. If you have global findings on migrant acceptance and an opportune moment like the unveiling of a new EU migration pact presents itself, time to release accordingly. Now, one thing that I should probably say before I move on to the next part of the presentation is just to kind of keep in mind the different types of reporters who might be interested in different stories that you have to tell, depending on what the data is, what the topic is, how niche the topic is, and even whether or not, they're freelance versus staff writers, whether you have, some of the additional human elements or whether it's just a true data story. One of the things that I've certainly seen and learned over time is that sometimes you have to know that the topic that you have is going to require reaching out to or building a relationship with somebody who might be more of a feature writer type, who might be more of a freelancer, somebody who has a little bit more time and freedom than sort of the constraints of the daily news cycle require. That was certainly the case when we did research that I just mentioned a minute ago on small business owners. We went the angle of trying to find a freelancer who was then able to take the time to delve into the research, but also talk to the people that our partners put forward who had used that research with great results. Meanwhile, though, there are certain reporters, or there are certain news desks and news outlets who, are already set up to work through kind of quick turn data stories. That's certainly the case, with certain reporters at Reuters, for instance, who covered this story on migrant acceptance right at the same time as the Migration Pact was being unveiled. So you just definitely want to keep in mind where, and think carefully about where you might need to develop different types of relationships. Next slide, Julie. Now, with all this said, as much as we try, we can't always insert ourselves as communicators in the process exactly when or where we'd like. So what are some things that you can fall back on to, to ensure that you still have some success? One thing, of course, is to stay generally prepared, meaning just continually developing and nurturing relationships with reporters based on your past work, and also keeping in mind what I just mentioned about when different types of reporters might be interested and what sorts of resources they'll need in order to cover your findings. Another thing, of course, is to think about data presentation. Do the data lend themselves to a scorecard or league table type presentation? I mean, sometimes having that can just be very, palatable and appealing to media. Another thing to think about is if you can't get standalone coverage, are there at least reference points that could be helpful for journalists who you're reaching out to? Creating a shareable top line can be helpful for reporters to refer back to for future coverage, even if, day of coverage when you're launching might not be possible. All right. So now I'm going to do something that Mohammed and Julie have both done already, but I wanted to put a couple of quick quiz questions in front of you. So the first one is, you just found out your company will have a new survey-based report coming out in a few weeks. Which of the following would not be the appropriate next step? Map out the findings thematically and group them by reporters' beats, work with your research leads, probing them for the most relevant insights, or complain to everyone that you weren't informed earlier. I'll give you just a second. Yep. It probably wouldn't be in your best interest to complain to everyone that you weren't informed earlier, but both A and B offer some good options for you to think about how you can move forward and get a good communications plan in place. One more, you've been invited by your research team to offer input on survey items for a report. Which of the following should you do next? Combining your knowledge of the project's research and communication objectives, sit down and position questions in ways that require your respondents to think about their life experiences and behaviors in new ways. B, wait until after the survey has begun fielding to suggest items. Or C, notify your research team that we have entered a post-truth era and that your input would be useless. I'll give you just a minute. Yeah, exactly. So A, of course, would be the best one, and that'll really position you well for success on the back end. All right. So just a couple of takeaways, in summary of what I've just gone over. So to recap, where possible, make the business case to your research counterparts and other partners that your involvement early on will improve outcomes. Be sure to continually engage in stakeholder engagement and management with journalists and other influencers who can amplify your findings. Consider the different types of reporters, of course, and what sorts of resources they'll need in order to cover your research. Think about framing and micro experiences, as I talked about. Think about the timing. Lean on your research partners for their guidance and expertise. They'll always be able to put you straight. And if all else fails, think through things like the scorecard effect or where your data can serve as helpful reference points later on. All right, so that's it for my part of the discussion. From here, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Mohammed.
Thank you, Riley, and thank you, Julie, for those wonderful insights and great presentations. So much great advice. I want to start, first of all, by encouraging everybody to type in your questions. We already have one awesome question, and I'll just pose this to both Julie and Riley. What is Gallup's experience of working with data journalists? Are you offering full data sets for their interpretations, or do you prefer to communicate your interpretations to them first, or obviously just ourselves? How do we approach that?
Riley, do you want to take that one?
Sure, this is a great question. They're definitely sort of a different set of journalists, and we absolutely love working with data journalists. It really depends on exactly who they are, and it depends on what our level of experience with them is, how much of their coverage we've seen, and just kind of how much we understand and are confident in their ability to, work through complex data sets and come to, meaningful conclusions. So there are certain journalists, data journalists that we work with who we have given pretty broad access of our data sets to. And we just have some long-standing relationships with them. And, there's a good amount of trust in place as to, what sorts of coverage they'll glean from it. So there are some cases where we do that, but I think a lot of times it's sort of a healthy mix of trying to give them as much data as possible to help them craft a story, while also trying to sort of shape the overall narrative that we think is most valuable or most instructive, given what the overall purpose of the research project was. Anything that you'd add to that, Julie?
Yeah, I would also add that, putting my researcher and analyst hat on, I am always willing to walk through the data with the data journalist. And I've done that on multiple occasions. And generally, I think that the journalists also find it useful as well. So, they can avoid any potential pitfalls.
All right, awesome. I'm going to add to that and just bring in some more. These questions are awesome. Thank you for sending them. Don't send them so quickly because it's hard to read the chat. What has been the most successful project that you guys have worked on, and how do you measure impact? I actually want to start by talking about an example of an unsuccessful experience I had with Gallup, working with data and journalism. Because I think in addition to the successful stories that Riley and Julie tell us about, it highlights the importance of what Riley and Julie are presenting. Years ago, we had an awesome study on Muslims in non-Muslim countries across Europe. It was actually a study that focused on integration and the cultural assimilation, if you will, depending on your politics, of Muslim communities in France, the UK, and Germany. It was a study that we did in obviously the local languages. We were really proud of just the methodological challenges we overcame to get representative samples. I know this audience understands that more than most. One of the challenges was among the gazillion findings in the report, one of the things we noticed were that Muslim respondents were less accepting of homosexuality than non-Muslim respondents. That became a huge headline in the media cycle around our report's release. And it really, in my opinion, distracted from all of the really interesting findings we also had in the report. What was more of frustrating was that actually when you break out the respondents in that study by religious affiliation, everybody who has a strong religious affiliation basically had those same views. So it wasn't actually something that made Muslims unique, really, when compared to other people who identify with a religion, but it created this headline that sort of became a distraction from so many other findings in that report. So there's an example of where things don't go great. And we learned a lot of lessons from that experience. But I'd love to hear from Julie and Riley on situations or examples of success.
Julie, do you want to kick that one off?
Sure. And I think that you kind of touched on this a little bit in terms of the Migrant Acceptance Index and that type of research. Of course, it's one of those things where there's kind of a perfect marriage of it being a very big topic and hot topic and us having data that goes with it. So that kind of fits that you taking advantage of the opportunity. If something's in the headlines and you've got something that informs that conversation or fits into the larger global conversation, kind of what I touched on in my presentation, it's kind of a win-win situation. We found that with our migration research, that it's really resonated. And it's easy for people to grasp. And it resonates with pretty much every single community in every single place around the world.
Riley, I want to jump in and pose some more of these questions because these are things you know a lot about. How do you assess the power of social media? How do you measure impact?
Yeah. Okay. So to start with the first one on social media, I think that social media can be a very powerful laboratory for understanding and very quickly testing how certain messages that you have from data projects can be. I think that it's great in a sense because it doesn't require you to write up an entire report. It doesn't require you, to prepare a press release. You can very quickly just come up with, let's say, 5 to 10 points from your research project, and you want to see how they'll land. And so social media can be very helpful for getting a quick sense and just doing quick tests to see how, let's say, particular audiences that use particular platforms, or even to put it more generally, just kind of general audiences will react to certain things. I think that it's very important to keep in mind that, what social media audiences respond to in data can often be very different from what journalist audiences will respond to. And I'll give you a case in point. One was that when we tried to post those findings on sort of the cumulative financial impact of, borrowing to pay for healthcare on our own social media accounts, to be honest, it really didn't do that well. It didn't actually get a ton of coverage, or it didn't get a ton of engagement, I should say. But then when we worked that same message through, through media angles with journalists, it really took off. So I would say it's great for understanding from sort of a testing and laboratory standpoint, sort of what kind of a large audience will think of research findings, but you do need to keep in mind that that may not be exactly what journalists will be interested in if you're interested in getting earned media, through that route. And then when it comes to impact, I would say that that really depends a lot on what the specific project is. And this is one, of course, that we're also always, that we're constantly thinking about fine tuning. Where is it that we can continually come up with additional ways of measuring impact? In some cases, it looks like, sort of qualitatively assigning, just sort of general value to certain types of media outlets where we'd like to see coverage. And sometimes that can be more niche publications, trade or industry publications, depending on the objective. Sometimes when we really want to get something far and wide, just as a general thought leadership bid, that can look like really wanting to try to get a lot of big coverage from, the Financial Times or the New York Times or Reuters or the Associated Press. So it certainly depends on the project. And then there are also things outside of just sort of the pure communications realm that you can consider as impact. And we certainly do sometimes. When I think of some of the work that we've done, I would say both around the world as well as in the US, we often look at, okay, how many citations are we seeing from policymakers in speeches or remarks that they give in different settings that mention the findings. And each one of those examples can be really valuable in its own right. So we definitely look at it from sort of, I would say we try to look at it from a holistic perspective, but also really considering what the value is of each potential outcome given the overall project and what it's trying to accomplish.
Thanks, Riley. Julie, I'm going to come to you next on a question with how we work with national statistical organizations. But before that, I want to just add something to what Riley said. From my own experience, I would just say, I know this sounds horrible. Not all journalism is created equally. Let me put it that way. So for our attendees here, you all have probably a series of topics or subjects that you tend to focus on in your field. If you look in your field, there are probably a handful of people that are sort of go-tos in terms of where to get reliable, solid, objective information on that topic. I can't stress enough how important it is for you to develop relationships with those journalists. These are people that are not looking for a flash in the pan headline. They're really looking for an objective, data-driven look at a major problem, they're committed to reporting on in the long term. So in my own personal experience, and I've seen Riley and the teams he leads do this so effectively, you know, we do have relationships with certain journalists that year in and year out have proven that they really are committed to reporting on global warming, and they want the latest data on global warming, and working with them is a very different exercise than letting a larger group of people know that you have data upcoming that would be relevant to their viewers. Julie, one of the questions we have is, what are some experiences Gallup has had working with national statistical organizations? How open are NSOs to providing data for Gallup's use for building sampling frames?
That actually gets into a little bit of an area where I am not probably the most familiar in terms of how we work with different organizations in collecting for our framing, for our sampling. You know, I think all of our surveys are nationally representative, and we do work with the national statistics organizations to make sure that our data are reflective of targets. So I think, you know, where those data exist and where those organizations are willing to share that information with us, it's fairly open. But again, you know, where those data don't exist, they don't exist.
Here's an interesting question. Don't you think that with COVID-19, people are losing confidence in data given either in social media or in official media? How do you establish or reestablish this confidence? But let me broaden that a little bit. Julie, how has COVID impacted us in the world poll? That's been a really great challenge for us in 2020. Do you want to talk us through a little bit of how we're tackling that?
Sure. I mean, it's a huge challenge. For most of the surveying that we do in countries where it's customary, we do phone surveys. So we do telephone, mobile phone. But for about 80% of the world, we did face-to-face survey research. So going house to house, village to village, and asking questions in person. So of course, you know, in the new COVID environment, that's not safe, and it's not something that we would subject people that we contract with and work with in all these countries, and it's not responsible. And so we had to really think how we're going to shift from doing things that we did primarily in person for so many years. I mean, every single year up until 2020, we've been doing in-person surveys in 80% of the countries. So that's, you know, in terms of sub-Saharan Africa and a lot of these different places, we were going house to house and doing all these surveys in person. So we had to think about how we could potentially still conduct our research and keep our surveys nationally representative, still make sure that they have the same data integrity. So it took a lot of thinking, and actually we had to kind of put a pin in our research for 2020 for a few months until we figured out a safe way to collect good data around the world. So we did make the switch, and a lot of these countries, at least I think the number is like 110. It's over 100 for sure this year. We're doing phone survey research, and we're working with our partners on the ground and training them to do surveys that they previously had done in person, and switching that mode and coming up with a way to do that it was very scientifically valid.
Thanks, Julie. And I want to address another question that we got earlier, which is basically, what do you do when your data is misquoted, or you discover that your data has been published and there's an error in it? And that's something as human beings we've all experienced and been through. It's going to happen. Our approach as founding members of APOR, but also just for our own standards, is to be very forward with clarifying, requesting a correction if it's a go-to source. One of the things some of you may be familiar with, if you're not, a really great voice on data visualization generally is Edward Tufte. He's a very famous professor here in the United States. He has a very famous quote, which is, "Every data presentation is a moral act," which is a really powerful way to put it. But you really are taking a huge amount of responsibility when you say, I've done a study and people think X. There's nothing we take more seriously at Gallup than when we see something being misquoted, or if certainly there's an error on our part, and you just absolutely have to fix it. It's much better for your developing trust with your sources to come out and fix things as opposed to ignoring them. Is there any difference in terms of the mechanism and format between when you communicate the data insights externally and internally across different departments at Gallup? That's a great question. I'll take that one. We have essentially a series of ways that we kind of decide, are we going to collect data? Are we going to work with this organization? And are these data represented enough to share externally? So we have a public release committee that before we do anything looks into, do we want to do this research? Does it make sense? Does it meet our standards of nonpartisan and neutral and objective data gathering and reporting? But we also have public release guidelines. And it's really important to have a position as an organization on what you will do with the data you gather after you gather it, but to establish that before you get the data back. When you do that, you demonstrate that you're not an organization that's interested in cherry picking the data, but you're committed to a methodology and you're going to report whatever you find, even if it doesn't make sense, quote unquote. You're obligated to really sort of explain why and where things maybe went wrong methodologically, et cetera. So our public release policy is actually on our website. It's a one-pager. It's very easy. It basically says, if we do research on a topic and it's intended to be shared with the public, we will share it with the public, irrespective of what the results are. That doesn't negate that we do a lot of work, survey research work, other data work for clients that are really intended just for their own internal decision-making, internal organizational efficacy, employee engagement, and others. So we do a lot of research. I think very little of it actually is shared with the public. We have much more than you would imagine, but we certainly have very clear guidelines, N size requirements, and the whole bit on what we can report publicly and what we can't. And we're always reviewing those, as you all should be. As methods change, as the world around us is changing. Julie just mentioned how the world poll is really facing a massive methodological challenge now, from going face-to-face to phone and some of these other methods. All of these things really need to be accounted for in how you are reporting your data, how transparent you're being about whether or not these things could impact results. So transparency really has always served us well. Julie, I don't know if you or Riley have anything to add.
Oh, I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head there.
All right. If you have any other questions, feel free to share them. We hope that this session has been useful for you. We have just a few minutes here left. Here's a great one. It is a bit difficult for me to translate the data into business insights. What is the steps and skills needed? That's such an awesome question. One really powerful word that I've become familiar with is ideation. You need to have somebody on your team that has ideation. This is a person that can see a mess of things that are interesting and really crystallize it down to, what does this mean and what's the most important thing to share? When you think about business insight, the most challenging thing you should do as a data organization, as an analyst, as a consultant, is always challenge yourself to get to the so what. If I'm paying you to tell me something, it better be something I don't know. It better be something I can rely upon. It better be something you've gathered in a way that you can demonstrate to me really does represent who you are speaking on behalf of. One last, Riley, this was a great one for you. Any guidance on building and maintaining relationships with reporters?
Yes, this is such a good one. I guess I would tackle it from a couple of different angles. First, there's just starting with the high level of identifying exactly who you want to be reaching out to and developing and nurturing relationships with. And that kind of feeds into your overall strategy, how much you know about your editorial calendar, what sorts of things you will be publishing over the next whatever 6, 9+ months, thinking about who those go-to sources are. So that identification is crucial. Now then I realized that sometimes there's a little bit of a chicken and egg scenario where if you don't have a lot of data to begin with, it can be a little bit challenging to get reporters' attention because they're so busy. They have so many different things they're focusing on. How can I get their attention if I don't have anything just yet? Well, I mean, I think sometimes you can start to make some inroads by just kind of being a good sort of professional colleague, sending sort of friendly, emails, observations on things that they've recently written, introducing yourself and sort of at least explaining the sort of overall purpose of what your team, what your organization is researching, what you're trying to communicate, just kind of getting an initial correspondence going, responding to things that they've written, kind of sometimes even sharing ideas with them, even if it may not ultimately 100% benefit you or your organization, but start to sort of position yourself as someone who has helpful things to say, helpful things to provide to that reporter. And that can start to help you make some inroads. Having data that you can share, even if it's not a fully fleshed out report yet, can also be helpful. I mean, I've seen ways where we've been able to get reporters on the phone for initial conversations or initial coffees pre-COVID, where we were just kind of going over top lines. We hadn't written up a full report of anything, but we had collected some data. It is definitely a game that you have to play with sort of a long-term view. It's not something that you'll usually be able to just craft overnight, but with some initial steps, whether it's data, which can certainly be most helpful to share, or whether it's just kind of the initial sort of basic building blocks of relationships that you start to put in place, I think over time you can really sort of create those trusted relationships.
That's awesome, Riley. One of the questions we have really quickly, I'm going to ask Andrea as the last one, but CT is asking, how would you react when you get negative comments in your data presented or in your data presentation? My only advice is the show must go on. I've had the craziest things happen in data presentations. You just got to stick with why you're there, stick to the data, never take anything personally. When people are poking at your data, 99% of the time it's because they don't agree with the results, and that's their problem, not yours. Okay, Andrea, this is a great question. In terms of accuracy versus timeliness, in the context of pressing circumstances, could you give an example where you've had that dilemma and what factors were taken into consideration? Thank you. I definitely have a lot. One of the things that come to mind for me is the news cycle, right? We always have another breaking news story. A lot of times we'll have data that can catch that news story. It's somehow relevant, but perhaps it's not really saying what the headline would say. Perhaps it is sending it to the wrong source is going to create kind of a media frenzy that isn't really responsible. We do that all the time. We always take into consideration, what does this headline say based on the data? Is it accurate? But also, how will this be received in the news cycle? Our commitment to neutrality and nonpartisanship is absolutely essential. Some of the reasons why we're able to do the world poll is because we're very open about the fact that we are not a civil rights organization or human rights organization, as much as important as those things are. Our mission is really just to get trends that are consistent across the world to measure human development. We share that with the folks that can multiply our message to our target audiences. We always try to think of who is our target audience when we try to create content for public consumption. We try to think through whether or not we're going to share that publicly before we gather the data. And I encourage you all to follow what we do at news.gallup.com. Julie is one of the most prolific writers truly in the world, really, on public opinion. You will see many, literally hundreds of her pieces from all over the world. Riley is a leader at Gallup that really has developed really critical media relationships with us, with organizations, some of which he mentioned, some he didn't, that we feel are targeting the folks we want to reach with our data. So when you go to look at your data, think about Who do I want to send this to? Who is my target audience? How can I get it there? Accept that you're not a communications expert. You are a data expert, and surround yourself with the tools and people that can help your wonderful science responsibly get to your target audience. With that, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Take care and be well.